for the first period, and it was not until 2008 that we switched to no-till. But the big point is that this paradigm of rotating with pastures was during the 60s, very much during the 70s and 80s, the general approach for producing cereals in Uruguay commercially. So we have 7 treatments that we will go into the details. This is the experimental area with a total of 21 plots. The pastures, we don't graze them, but we do just mowing, and we keep records of yields and soil tests. So the treatments, in order to go a little bit into the details about the design of those, there is a row of continuous cropping. The cropping phase lasts 3 years, and that continues over and over. This one has no fertilizer at all from the beginning, and it is, of course, the most degrading system. This system is paralleled by a second one with the same cropping sequences, but with addition of nitrogen and phosphorus. There is a variation for continuous cropping, and then the rest, the 4 remaining treatments, do have pastures in the system with different amounts of time in the cycle. So there is one that has, in a 3-year rotation, just 1 pasture that lasts about a year. So we say this is a third, a system with 1/3 of pasture in the rotation. Then there are 2 with 50-50. You see basically the same cropping sequence as we have in the continuous, but then rotated with 3 years of pasture. These pastures differ slightly in the sense that this is a polyspecies, fescue, white clover, and trefoil birdspoil, lotus. And then we have still another rotation that has more than 50-50 because it combines this pasture together with a red clover. So it has more pastures in the rotation than years under crops. So this is how we define our treatments. And one slide for the results on soil organic carbon, how it changed through time. Starting point was about 2% soil organic carbon, and the different treatments either caused a decrease, a sharp decrease in soil organic carbon. This is the one that I mentioned before, the most degrading one, the one that has no fertilizer added under continuous cropping, and this one would be the paired one with fertilizers. And then the one with pastures caused a net increase through time. One point here that is interesting is that the white and the blue that differ only in the inputs of fertilizer, it took about 20 years before it was possible to realize a difference in soil organic carbon. And now it is very much obvious how degrading this one can be. And this is another example of results that we have obtained from this experiment. This is actually Valentina Rubio's work, and she will be giving a talk later specifically on yields and organic carbon from this experiment. But this one here is on soil physical properties, the least limiting water range as an approach to look at the soil environment for growing plants as affected not only by the water holding capacity, affected not only by field capacity and wilting point, but also by aeration and penetration resistance. So we found out with this that at a bulk density that when it reaches 1.6, the least limiting water range becomes 0, which would be the most restricting condition. Switch to the next experiment. This is INIA 33, the work by José Terra. This one started in 1995 on a typic argudole, under no tillage since the beginning, and the starting condition being natural grasslands, so relatively undegraded, with annual crops that can be either for forage or for grain, that rotate then with long or short pastures. And then the experimental area is much bigger. It covers a total of 72 hectares. Each plot is 3 hectares in size, so it reminds me to some extent to Kate's experiment that we heard of this morning, California. It is directly grazed, both the forage annual crops and the perennial pastures, commercial equipment, and it also has replications as the one before, and that they are not synchronic, so we don't have a rep for each condition, a rep within a year, but we do have reps through years, which I do refer to as staggered replications. So this is a picture of a type of soil, more differentiated, more leached soils, and results. So here we will compare for total organic carbon and fractions of the total organic carbon for the different systems that we have in place, even comparing against a native grassland reference. And what it is saying is that continuous cropping had about 23% lower soil organic carbon than the permanent pasture, just 10 years after the beginning, starting from undegraded condition. And the crop pasture had 10% lower soil organic carbon than the permanent pasture. And then after 20 years, they repeated the study, showing that this went up to 31, just a little higher. And that this decrease under continuous cropping would be higher under forage crops that are harvested by animals compared to grain crops where you have the residues remaining on the soil. And this is Raquel Barros' work, a postdoc that is associated with us since the end of last year, who was actually also going to come and join with us this meeting. She has prepared the poster that is up there and putting together both experiments that we mentioned and looking at carbon stocks through the profile. And I don't know if the colors here will help, but it is showing that obviously the higher the amount of pastures in the system, the higher the carbon stock you will get. But there is also indications that this can be due to also deeper soil layers. A third experiment back in La Estanzuela that is actually on tillage and rotations, so kind of questioning how far we will get with the no-till system in a rotation. Details right there. We do have some direct grazing on pastures. It is a factorial 2x2, so we do the minimum tillage versus zero tillage, and we do have just one type of rotation, the mixed 50-50 against the continuous cropping. And results for these show that both doing no-till and doing the mixed crop pasture system will have an effect on soil organic carbon. This is looking at the uppermost sampling depth. So it is both of them have a, if you want, independent effect or simple effect on soil organic carbon. And same thing occurred with this other soil indicator of organic matter quality, which is the potentially mineralizable nitrogen. It looks for a more labile, biologically active carbon pool, and it resembles the same effect. So finally, I'll go to this newer experiment that is located again in the east of the country towards the frontier with Brazil on rice pasture rotation systems as a key for sustainable intensification in Uruguay. This is again work by Jose Terra. Here an example of a publication from this already, from this system and this consistent growth of average yields of commercial fields of rice in Uruguay, and we are about now reaching this 8,000 kilograms per hectare frontier. So this long-term experiment on rice rotations in Uruguay looks for intensification pathways. It is on an area of 8 hectares with 60 plots, and it is a complete design with all phases of the rotations coexisting in a randomized clock and 3 reps with direct grazing, not with cattle, but with lambs, no-till, with exceptions when needed because of especially during harvest, when the soil is not adequately drained, it may require some sort of tillage. So here, a brief overview of the concepts behind the treatments. This would be the best the best current management practice in Uruguay with a rotation. So this idea of the pasture rotations, as I told, was widely adopted not only on rain-fed agriculture, but also on paddy rice. And from there on, there are strategies for intensification. So reducing the amount of time of pasture, shortening the pasture, or including some other crops, not only rice, but also soybean, more crops, or even continuous rice with just cover crops. So these are different venues for intensification. Perfect. So here we're looking at the rice yields from this experiment. I'll try to get straight to the final slides in order to have the right time. So from these isolated experiments, of which I told you roughly some details on 4 of them, in INIA we are in the process of putting them together into a coherent network that will integrate them and also among disciplines. So the key points or goals that we have established for this process is that we want to holistically approach sustainable intensification, looking at farming systems or even management practices. It has to be, of course, long-term to appropriately evaluate effects on soil and crop, as well as externalities. We want to observe and understand the interactions of climate and production and environment, and we want to provide data for further improving the models, which is an excellent tool to work in addition with this and to organize the knowledge that we gain. So in terms of actions and steps forward that we have already taken, we have made an internal systematic discussion on the current status of our individual LTEs and tried to assess the strengths and the weaknesses. We have developed a proposal that was finally approved by the board of directors. We have generated several activities with international institutes of excellence, such as Rothamsted, with different activities going on. Also with other institutes, and this is an example of Germany, we have contacted 2 postdoctoral fellows that are working on our long-term experiments, and we have then already teamed up with the university to develop a proposal. So in conclusion, it is about a number of long-term experiments for field crop production that we have in Uruguay, and a plan for integrating them into a network to approach sustainable intensification. The work is still in progress, and we'll hope that soon we can then come up with results. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Andres. I'm seeing a big 0 here, so I'm afraid there's no time for questions. So the next speaker, Frank, from the University of Bonn, please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to be here at this particular occasion of the 175th anniversary. At the University of Bonn, we celebrate the 200 years anniversary, so I missed the 175. I'm also at the, or mainly now at the Leibniz Center of Agricultural Landscape Research. We celebrated our 25th anniversary last year, and I will not make a 275 there. This presentation will be slightly different than the presentation you have seen so far. I will not look at individual long-term field experiments. I take the perspective of a modeler, crop modeler, cropping system modeler, and give you some ideas of what we would like to see or what the benefits are of these long-term field experiments to our work, and perhaps vice versa also benefits from our work to the long-term field experiments. Here we have the correct affiliations. The structure of my presentation, I give first some background information on crop modeling, cropping system modeling to get you into the topic, say something on the use of LTEs, some selected results and challenges and opportunities towards the end. Most of you are, I guess, familiar with modeling, cropping system modeling. Crop models simulate the behavior of crops in response to different factor groups, soil-related, atmosphere-related, management-related, and they also have crop characteristics. And they do that considering a number of physiological processes as far as crops are concerned, and some are listed here: photosynthesis, phenology, nutrient uptake, etc., just to mention a few. Regarding the factor groups, there's a number of factors in there, and that makes these models quite powerful because they can consider all these factors and their actions potentially. And what they also do, they can simulate the dynamics of certain processes. And here some are listed with respect to total biomass, grains, leaf area index, roots, etc. And one particular advantage of these models is that they consider feedback loops. So that anything that happens early in the season, depending on this last scope of interaction, will also more or less affect what will happen later in the season. That's difficult to tease out with statistical models. Dynamic simulation models can do that, and we therefore also call them dynamic, deterministic, process-based numeric simulation models. Coming from a crop model to a cropping system model, already indicated there are feedback loops considered as far as crop growth is concerned. Also with respect to the crop-soil interaction, there are lots of feedbacks that these models consider. If we move to a cropping system, sort of add up crop-soil interactions, then we are also able to simulate or consider some of the carryover effects within a cropping system. So they're quite powerful tools, and it needs some good skills in order to use these models properly. Regarding the applications, there are different types of applications for which we use these models related to research, teaching, decision support, communication. I mainly refer to research here, and I just give you some indication of the type of research we do with these models related to model intercomparison, model development, model improvement. Say a few words about that in the presentation. Also, these models can be useful to analyze and understand your data. something you are not easily able to see with statistical methods, for instance. We use them in integrated modeling to do impact assessment, integrated impact assessment of farming systems, cropping systems apparently as well, markets, etc. And also we tap in more extensively in with the, or link up with the functional structural plant modeling community with respect to use these models for virtual phenotyping, for instance, and linking up with breeders here. There's apparently also an element of scale in this, if you look from the very detailed applications to the more broader applications. And the scaling issue is an important aspect. And scaling adds to the uncertainty that we have in these models. We are well aware of this. There's uncertainty in the input data, there's uncertainty in the model structure and the parameters, and there's an uncertainty in the outputs. And regarding the scaling, we do some manipulation of the data, and the scaling is an important thing because many of the things that we are addressing here with respect to food security have an element of scaling in it. So what we presently are concerned with is how to transfer the information that we obtain and simulate from crop models that are originally developed at field scale to a larger scale farm region, to the globe. And there's a change of information in there. Just to give you an example here, if you move from one single field and you see a plot of yields across a number of years to a state, North Rhine-Westphalia, to the country level, to the global level, you see how much information you use in the yield signal to whatever has affected that variability. Now, we spent quite a lot of time in understanding the mechanisms and some of the key relationships we should consider with respect to scaling. Eventually, we want to be able to say something about what happens in a farm, in a region, and also in the globe, at the globe. And I've included an example here to illustrate a possible application of these models, in this case at the global level, with respect to climate change impact. Why are we looking or want to look at long-term field experiments? As a crop modeler or crop modelers, cropping system modelers, we need data. We need data apparently on climate, on CO2. We need data on soil characteristics, crop characteristics, management. Many of these data are provided by long-term field experiments, most of these data. But they're also provided by other experiments. So what is so unique about the long-term field experiment, why we should want to think about it? The long-term field experiments, we have time series. That's something you do not always find in all experiments. But there are changes. And some people, Kate said this morning, we are a bit shy about the changes that we did in our experiment, and they are a concern. Changes with respect to management, with respect to the experimental setup, and also with respect to the genetics. I've taken this graph out here as an example. We've seen that yesterday, how management has changed, not as a factor, but as a general treatment, not a treatment, a general activity in the experiment. And that's something that we are, of course, concerned with, to which extent we can consider that. And there are changes in the varieties grown, and I will come back to that later in the presentation. Another big aspect why we find them interesting is that many of these experiments test rotations. And there is another item that becomes increasingly interesting, and that is the aspect of the spatial variability of these experiments. But that only becomes into play if we are able to consider different long-term field experiments jointly. I come back to that as well. Eventually, if we are able to gather all this data, we can say something about the environment management interaction and perhaps also about the G times E times M interaction, at least to some extent. Basically model the potential yield and what we call the attainable yield. We have some problems still with the actual yield. That's something that is an ongoing activity. Some examples of, changing now to a section where I will show you some results of the work that has been ongoing. There are different communities. There's the crop modeling, cropping system modeling community, and there's also the soil modeling community. And there's some interaction between these, but not a great deal. So the soil modelers have used these data from the long-term field experiments quite extensively, and they're good examples of how these data have been used. And I've taken an example here because we're here from Rothamsted, because we're here in Rothamsted, Nice example where the Rothschild model has been used in order to be able or see to which extent the change in soil organic carbon could be represented by this model for different treatments. And there's also, it dates some years back, an effort where people have tried in the SOMNet network to gather data from different experiments and use these data also in the modeling exercise. It's great work. Not sure where this actually is, whether that has been continued, but a great effort to get data from different locations. So you sample a nice climate gradient here, which is really a great basis for doing modeling activities. With respect to the crop modeling, we see fewer studies. This is one of the few studies that we see where people have actually tried to model a rotation from a long-term field experiment. This is in Müncheberg, where I work now, and where they look at different parameters, variables. Above ground biomass also looked at yield, nitrogen uptake, and soil mineral nitrogen. And here you see a simulation, not going into the details of the results, just a general point. There are some examples where models have been used with data from long-term field experiments. And that's another example in this study. A second experiment has been used. And here you can see, if you just compare these two lines, how well the model does if you really consider what's going on in terms of the feedbacks in the soil, as compared to a situation where you just assume a soil from a soil database that is similar to what's found in the location. So a great deal to learn from this exercise. But there's only one model used here, and the number of years is only constrained to 5, although the experiments run much longer. But in the case of Lauchstädt, more than 100 years. We have made some effort recently to try to get more data from different field experiments in order to understand how well our models do with respect to simulating rotations. And that's a nice study that was recently performed and published, where we used more than 50 crop models, cropping system models, and see to which extent these models are able to reproduce, in this case, yield, what you see here for different crops: maize, wheat, barley, rye, oat, sugar beet, potato, oilseed rape, etc. And you can see that for some crops we do quite well, for other crops we are not really happy. This is the normalized mean error of the simulation compared to the observation. You also see the difference if you consider the rotation. These are the open circles, as compared to the situation where you ignore the rotation and just simulate single crops. And there's a great deal to consider rotations for several crops in the simulations and reduce the error. One aspect here is that these long-term field experiments have different treatments, so they're difficult to put them in a fully orthogonal experimental setup. They studied different treatments, and people in this exercise teased that out and looked at the treatment of water, if it was tested, treatment of nitrogen, etc., treatment of tillage, residues. And you can see how well the models do in comparison to the observations in order to reproduce what was found in the observations. And there's a great deal to learn from these type of exercises. But again, here, only few years were used. 5 to 10 years were used in these exercises, although the experiments ran longer, over a longer time period. And one reason is that, and that's an example from a long-term field experiment that we run for more than 100 years in Bonn. It's a little sketch here of that experiment, are these trends. We have problems to reproduce presently in our models these trends. There are different reasons for these trends. They're management related, I made that point earlier, and they are genotype related. And we may have the management information, we may be able to consider the management information in our models, but we quite often do not have the variety information. Well, we have an excursion here to an archive, sample archive. That archive does not give you the characteristics that we need in order to parameterize our models for the crop that are grown, the varieties that were grown in these years. And eventually we would like to be able to reproduce that variability that you have depending on the treatments that you have interannually and that you have because of the trend. But with respect to the trends, our biggest problem. So what we did in that experiment, in order to be able to calibrate our model, we regrew all varieties that were grown across 100 years in a direct comparison. And that's a picture from that, a direct comparison of all the varieties. And interesting enough, we obtained another result, and I just show you that briefly, which helped us to reduce the uncertainty in our models with respect to the estimation of phenology. We found that although varieties were always classified as mid-maturing varieties, they actually were not the same type of variety. And that is what you can see here. In the direct comparison, the flowering date of the varieties declined and hence became earlier. And the photovernal thermal time, that's a parameter that we use in our models, also reduced. Now, in our assessment studies, we always assumed the same parameter because we always thought that it's a mid-maturing variety. So we made a mistake, and you make a mistake also if you do projections. That's just one process. It also will quite likely apply to other processes if we are not aware of these specific varieties. So this is just one date from this experiment, and you can see how different the cultivars were, how much earlier a present cultivar is compared to an older cultivar. And the improvement in the results by considering this, the cultivar effect, you can see here, comparison of observed with simulated data in comparison to the situation that we had before. For these processes, we have a great database in Germany available, and other countries have that as well, in order to test that. So behind each bin, there are hundreds of simulation and data points coming from this database, running over 50 years, more than 6,000 stations. It's a good database to test. We don't have that for crop rotations. And we have to be smart in order to understand how we go about that. So if you just tease out a little spot here, in Germany, we see how diverse in terms of the fields and the crops, the landscape can be, and each field is a unique incidence of soil, climate, management, and crop rotation. And in order to scale up from here, that's something that we would like to understand better, and we've done quite some work on this in recent years with respect to understanding the effect of aggregation and with respect to the understanding of the effect of sampling in order to come from information of single points to a region or to other points in the region. Just be aware, when you take farmers to your field experiment or to your long-term field experiment and show them what you've done, you scale up basically. If you tell them, if you're a smart researcher and tell them, well, what we see here may not apply to you because you have a different soil, etc., then you put an error bar around your information and you leave it up to the farmer to fill that error bar. If it's a smart farmer, he thinks about it. If it's not a smart farmer, he just takes the result and does the same thing in his field. And there are huge errors, huge variability here, soil conditions in these areas. This is just an example which I will skip, how we sampled with respect to yield simulations. We have also thought about how we could aggregate crop rotations. We can either assume monocrop, we can assume one rotation in a region, which you've just seen, or we consider the rotations that we find in the region. And we have done some modeling exercise in order to understand the error that we make by doing the one or the other approach. And what you can see here is an example of these outcomes. For autumn wheat, the error of the 4 different ways of monocropping, 2 monocropping activities, single rotation, and a cohort of rotation, not much different occurs. For other crops, the differences are larger. And for some of the other outcomes, soil nitrogen, for instance, the differences become considerable. Okay. In Bonares, it was already mentioned, we make a great effort in order to capture data from different field experiments, long-term field experiments. More than 200 long-term field experiments are actually performed in Germany in order to sample the soil, be able to have some sampling of the soil, climate, space that we find in Germany. And from that, we think that will help us in order to scale up from the experiments that we have to say something about regions and to say something about the entire country in that case. And there's a presentation later on in the next session that will give more information on this. There's lots of data issues involved, and we had already presentations about the FAIR data. And I also want to refer to a workshop in the afternoon where more information is given of how the FAIR data concept is implemented for this specific situation in Germany and the Bonn-Rest project. I want to conclude. I think there is a great deal of data to use for cropping system model in order to improve the model, in order to test the model. However, the biggest benefit, I think, lies in using the multitude of data sets that we have available. That's a big issue that I think we are falling too short at the moment in order to utilize the potential that we have there. I think we will also always have adjacent experiments in order to complement what we do not see and get from these experiments. In addition, we will have an increasing amount of data from other data sources. And that data sources is also something we should consider and use in complementing the information we have from here. In addition to that, there's lots of monitoring, farm monitoring, landscape monitoring going on, eventually also of use and to be considered. And my last comment here is that this will not exclude, and that was a comment made yesterday, the networking within a landscape and the social aspect will still be important, independent of how many data we get. With this, I'd like to thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Frank. Yeah. Unfortunately, the time is finished. So now we'll have 5 10-minute flash talks. You have 10 minutes. When it's 9 minutes, I will stand up and I will gradually get closer to you. Yeah? So when I'm really close, then it's really time to finish. So the first speaker is Mike Grosser. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm Meike. I work at the Leibniz Institute for Agricultural Landscape Research in Zalf, Müncheberg, Germany. And I give a short speech about the use of long-term field experiments in soil research. The example of the German program Bona-Res. Bona-Res means the good thing, it's Latin. Or it's short for soil as a sustainable resource for the bioeconomy. It started 2015. Its duration is planned for 9 years, and that is rather long. It exists out of 10 collaborative projects. These are the symbols of the projects. They deal with specific research questions for sustainable soil use. And there's the Bonn-Res Center, which task is to coordinate, to make networking, to establish a central database, to do modeling, and to establish a web portal. So I'm working in the Bonn-Res Center. And you can find information on this website, bonnares.de. The Bonn-Res portal provides information about the Bonn-Res projects, access to data, knowledge and models, and decision support options for sustainable soil management. And long-term field experiments are an important basis for the research in Bonn-Res and also for the research in the Bonn-Res projects. And we have one task in the Bonn-Res Center to make an overview of all long-term field experiments in Germany. Our definition is that they have a duration of at least 20 years and a static design. We started with a literature review and an online search. We searched for background information, websites, research parameters, experimental setup, and for the contact person, of course. And we could start a network. We had a workshop in 2017. And the personal contacts got more and more important for our work. And we found 203 long-term field experiments in Germany. So these dots are 203, maybe they are a bit overlapping. And I give a short overview about this information. So most experiments are between 20 and 49 years old, but we have 3 experiments which are more than 100 years and 53 experiments which are between the age of 50 and 99 years old. Unknown means we don't have the date of the exact ending, so these are finished experiments, and sometimes it's very difficult to get information then if the person retired and no one is there whom you can ask. But we know they are older than 20 years because they are mentioned in important sources. And some experiments are at the moment below the age of 20, but they get this age within the duration of Bonn-Arrest, so we included them in our research. 141 experiments are ongoing and 62 are finished. Most farming systems are conventional. There are 14 organic trials, 5 which call themselves integrated, and 2 compare conventional and organic agriculture. The land use is in most experiments field crops, in 37 experiments grassland, and in 3 experiments vegetables and pomiculture. The research theme is in most experiments fertilization. This has also historical reasons. In 37 experiments tillage, and 31 experiments crop rotation, and 26 experiments deal with other research questions. It can be very diverse. The holding institution is in most experiments a university or technical college, and there are also state authorities, non-university scientific institutions, and the industry. You can find this information in an online overview map for long-term field experiments. It gives you the opportunity to search long-term field experiments in Germany. It offers different display and search functions, and it was published via the Bonn-Arrest portal in March 2017. It's available in German and English. So you get to this landing page, you have a search option, you have different categories here you can choose, and if you click on a single dot, detailed information appears. And this is a trial from Zalf-Müncheberg. It started 1963, and it gives some information, and the exact position is shown. So it is not only the task to give an overview of the long-term field experiments, but we try also to get research data of long-term field experiments, to compile them in a central database, to structure the data, and to make quality checks. And we want to give them for free reuse, so open data. And the data from our Müncheberg trial 440, will be available soon. And we have made contracts with some other long-term field experiments, and the data is in process, and it's much work. So sometimes the data is not in digital form now, and the trial holders get support to do that and to make a nice form, so it's easily available after that. And if you want to hear more about problems and solutions, you can go to the workshop number 2 this afternoon. Our project Bonn-Arrest is going on, and we have planned to make an extension of the overview map. And to do intensified networking, there will be a new workshop next year in spring 2019. There is hopefully further data acquisition, and there shall be joint papers in cooperation with LTFE holders. This is our team. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mike. We have time for one comment or question, if there is. Hakim. Can I try?
You're really bad at these things. I think that's what you call an outlier, Bernard. I have just one question. How did you convince BMBF to fund this for 9 years?
Oh, I really don't know. But what I heard is that Bonares now is a good example, and that they plan to do more research in such a long time.
I could add up. This is a unique funding construct. The project that has just been described is sort of an umbrella project on top of 10 projects in the field of more basic-oriented soil science research, soil science. So the issue of long-term field experiments was added to that because it was found to be an important part and should not be overlooked.
Okay. All right, thanks. Thanks again. The next speaker is Mangilal Yat from CIMMYT. Again, 10 minutes, starting now.
Thank you so much. 4 seconds, 5 seconds, 6 gone already. Which one? This one? Green one, okay. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm making this presentation on behalf of a whole lot of colleagues from CIMMYT as well as National Agriculture Research System in India. So just to repeat at the cost of repetition, the challenges what we have in South Asia, and of course everywhere. The yield stagnation or the yield gaps, that's one of the major one. There's a whole lot of soil degradation. We have a problem because our trials are more of irrigated system, and there's a whole lot of flood irrigation and a lot of water, groundwater depletion issues. You may have heard last 1 year a lot of air pollution in Delhi and around in India because of the crop residue burning, which is another big issue. And of course, a mention was made yesterday, fertilizer, nitrogen use, overuse or misuse. There's a lot of scarcity in terms of labor and of course energy, and more on top of that, climatic risk. So the challenge is how to ensure the future food security and farmers' income so that they can stay in the agriculture while sustaining our natural resources and of course addressing the climatic risk. There are solutions, and we choose conservation agriculture as one of the key way to address some of those issues. I will not repeat what is conservation agriculture is all about. There were presentations yesterday, but what we are trying to do is not only having these 3 interrelated principles of conservation agriculture, but also layering adapted management, where is the water, nutrient, varieties, or scale appropriate machinery, because they are required, and the layering is very important. So this is a network of our long-term trials, around 10 long-term trials. They are not that long because it's on conservation agriculture, which is a recent origin. But still we have long-term trials, around 10 in Indo-Gangetic plains, western as well as eastern Indo-Gangetic plain, covering major cereal-based systems, which is rice, wheat, rice, maize, maize, wheat, maize, mustard, something like that. And also having the elements of tillage, cropping systems, legumes, nutrients, residues, and of course water management. So we got measurements on these, including yields, income, water, energy, soil health, including physical, chemical, and biological, and also how it is helping in adapting to climatic risk, greenhouse gas mitigation, and so on and so forth. So this is one summary slide from one of the long-term experiment we started. In 2009, when Akeem was leading our project CISA, that's the one of the long-term trial, and you can see over a period of 8 years, this is 8-year result. If we talk about sustainable development goals on how to inform the policymakers and why these are important, and you can see there's a whole lot of gains in terms of productivity, there's a lot of water saving, energy saving, increase in the income, and significant improvement in the soil organic carbon, and of course reduction in the global warming potential from around 20 to 30% when we move from conventional, rice wheat system to the conservation agriculture-based rice wheat or maize wheat. That's a diversified system. There's another experiment, again around 10 years, and you can see the yield trends in maize wheat rotation, and you can see the gap between the conventional tillage and the conservation agriculture is widening over a period of time. We also, measuring, as I say, the climate change adaptation. So this is one example how conservation agriculture, helps in adapting to the terminal heat. And you can see at the grain filling period, if you got a heat effect and if you got a residues on the surface, you are buffering around 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature, canopy temperature. And to breed a variety, to adapt to that one takes a lot of time, and you got a technology in adaptation. There's another example which is coming from we got a huge rains at the grain filling stage in wheat in 2014-15. There was a huge loss in the wheat productivity, and government of India had to pay a lot of compensation. And you can see two machines looking the same, but this is conservation agriculture, and this is burning and tilling. And you can see the loss because of the excess rains, and you can see the crop in the same farmer's field. There's another one. We are trying to diversify, but if you diversify with the conventional tillage management system, it's not going to help. And there was rain 200 plus millimeters in 2-3 days, and you can see the crop, which is conventional till bed, and this is permanent bed, and you can see what is adapted more to the climatic risk. So the long-term trials what we got, for example, Eastern IGP in rice wheat and rice maize system, that tells that we got more stable yields at the higher probability level when you have the conservation agriculture. But if you have no-till without residue, that can be worse than the conventional till even. So we're trying to put together the metadata of whatever work is done on conservation agriculture in South Asia, and this is the analysis. So again, we have to see from a perspective, we are in an irrigated ecosystem. Even if you got one crop no-till and one crop conventional till in a irrigated system, you got still little gains in the productivity. If you had full till, no-till in both systems, you have residues here and you got a rotation. So there's an increment, but even the no-till conventional till cycle is in short term is not unsustainable. So that's why we need to have the guidance from the long-term trials. And as I said, the performance of the portfolio practices, layering, no-till residues and rotations and water management, I think they got additive effects if we talk about adaptation and mitigation to the climate effect. There was a presentation in the morning, and we are also working on subsurface drip, layering of subsurface drip and fertigation with conservation agriculture, even the layering with the solar irrigation, and you can see a whole lot of benefits coming out, but it's a no-till system, not the conventional till system. Using all those evidence, what we did to help the government, we come up with this picture, and put a policy brief and inform the government to help them to get rid of this pollution problem because of the residue burning. And these are the policy briefs or the documents what we prepared and shared with the government so that the conservation agriculture can be taken to the next level. And based on this, the government of India took a decision to put together $170 million for in-situ management and primarily on the conservation agriculture just recently. And this document, the implementation scheme, just came out 2 days back. So there's a full impact at the scale. We also, using all those trials, did a pan-India analysis, where are the opportunities for climate change mitigation from agriculture, no cost. And we find in no-till and nutrient management and water management got a huge potential for mitigation of greenhouse gases in Indian agriculture, which contribute nearly 1/5 from these options of whatever agriculture footprints are there. We are using of these no-till platforms or the long-term trials for capacity development. It's very important. So we got a course in Mexico, but we started a course in India, and we are going to organize the 9th one in coming October. Until now, we trained some 140 researchers across 14 countries, and also there are a whole lot of students coming, and you can see the geography where from the people are coming. So these platforms are really serving the capacity development platforms. The last slide, the few messages. The long-term experiments are a must for science-informed policy and investment guidance for sustainable farming future. I think that's what is required. Long-term conservation agriculture research supports a lot of sustainable development goals as we got the evidence. And also the long-term experiments are the key learning platforms for the new generation of the researchers. And they serve as a converging platform for science and society. I think that's why we need to have the long-term experiments. Yeah, that's all. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, quite impressive. Yeah, well done. Yeah. Yeah, we've used our time. The next speaker is Lionel Jordan May from INRA. Welcome.
Good morning. I'm Lionel Jordan May from INRA, which is the French Institute of Agronomy, and I'm going to tell you about two original studies from a long-term fertilization experiment on which I've been working for more than a decade. The site, set up in 1995, is situated in the southwest part of France, near Bordeaux. Most of you probably know Bordeaux for its wine, but it's also in the heart of a large area cultivated with corn, the crop grown on our trial. The site is located on sandy soils, characterized by very limited mineral reservoir, low water retention capacity, and high water infiltration rates. And as the summer tends there to be very dry, huge volumes of water are required if the corn is to reach its potential growth of 15-16 tons per hectare. The trial is split into two parts, one dedicated to phosphorus, the other one to potassium. On each part, 5 doses of fertilization are replicated on 4 blocks. And the very poor initial values of phosphorus and potassium on those sandy soils allowed a large gradient in both phosphorus and potassium to be obtained. So from 6 to 50 ppm Olsen P for phosphorus, and from 20 to 100 ppm exchangeable potassium from the upper layer. My first study examines the risk of phosphorus leaching. This type of transfer is generally very low due to multiple chemical binding sites like iron or aluminum oxides. As a consequence, phosphorus transfer can be represented as moving from one layer to a deeper one only once a certain threshold value is reached. As you can see in this figure, taken from literature, phosphorus is transferred into drainage water just above, in this example, the value of 60 ppm of Olsen P. In this field, in this example from literature, fields were artificially drained, thanks to what water was easily sampled. However, in many cases, the absence of drainage pipe will complicate the sampling of water and hence the establishment of environmental references. This is why we developed a method that allowed us to calculate phosphorus leaching even in the absence of drainage pipes or any other way to collect soil water samples. So on the phosphorus trial, phosphorus uptake was systematically measured on an annual basis, and every 4 years, Olsen P was measured on 3 horizons. Total phosphorus was also measured twice. When an increase of phosphorus was measured in the deeper layers, it was interpreted as an indicator of phosphorus leaching from the surface layer. The quantity of phosphorus transferred was calculated using a mass balance at the soil layer level and was equal to the lack of balance. The 4 yearly measurements of Olsen P showed that the 2 deeper horizons only increased their phosphorus level for fertilization rates greater than 20 kilos per hectare and year. We then focused our attention on the 3 higher fertilization rates. We plotted the calculated excess phosphorus in function of the corresponding Olsen phosphorus in the surface layer. And the results showed slightly different threshold values for phosphorus transferred below 25 or 50 centimeters in function of surface Olsen P. What really surprised us was that the critical leaching Olsen P values were in the same order of magnitude than the one established for optimum yield. You are probably at ease with this kind of representation, relative yield and Olsen P. We can regret that such environmental threshold values do not interfere with fertilization rules, at least in France. Taking into account such transfer could, however, prove an extremely interesting opportunity for future fertilization research. My second example focuses on the role of potassium in the plant water use. Potassium is known to interfere with plant water uptake through its action on root growth and also on stomatal regulation, which influences water transpiration. The trial allowed us to test under real field conditions the effect of potassium nutrition levels on the way water was used by corn plants. This is the potassium trial, and we divided this site into 2 parts. One, normally irrigated to field capacity, and the other only receiving around 2/3 of this amount in order to confront the plants to water stress. We used the frontal irrigation ramp to differentiate the irrigation rate, and we calculated water consumption from water probes, measuring continuously soil water content. One of the main results of this water potassium experiment was that potassium fertilization promoted, as expected, leaf surface and hence a higher transpiration rate. But the increase in water consumption, these lines, was always lower than the leaf surface increase, suggesting better stomatal regulation and ultimately better water use efficiency. We also took infrared measurements to improve the understanding of the stomatal functioning under different potassium and water modalities. For example, colder temperature would signify a higher transpiration rate, which would be beneficial to the plant under normal water conditions, but which could jeopardize its survival under water stress. We used the drone to take 10-minute movies at various intervals during the day. I won't be giving you all the details now. I just wanted to underline that the use of the long-term field enabled us to check some results that had previously been obtained only at pod scale and under very controlled conditions. To conclude, I would like to share 3 ideas with you. First, combining agronomical and environmental approaches amply confirms the need to carry such full-scale experimental framework on an ongoing basis. Second, I hope I have convinced you that measuring more parameters than those initially defined as strictly necessary extends the potential scientific use of those trials. Third, we should never forget that plant and soil samples have to be kept safely in order to be reused for unexpected thematics, such as the 2 examples I selected for you. Lack of money often explains why those long-term experimental tend to disappear. However, all of us today, we should raise our voices together so that we can obtain that long-term fertilization experiment would be classified in UNESCO list for services rendered and for those yet to come. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thanks. Again, we have time for 1 minute. Don't be afraid, I will not throw the ball again. Don't be afraid to ask a question. If there is any, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. The work on phosphate leaching, which you quoted, was done by Gosling Heckrath and my colleague Phil Brooks here on the Broadborg experiment. And they thought that the mechanism of phosphate getting into the drains was not so much moving from layer to layer, but through bypass flow, through cracks or root channels and so on. I wonder if you thought that's what was happening in your experiments or not.
We have sandy soils which are not really appropriate to have those short circuit connections. Okay. But you're right, cracks may explain rapid transfers. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Lionel. Thank you, merci beaucoup. The next speaker is Joichiro Kato, from the University of Tokyo.
Good morning. Well, I used to work at the INIA and taking care of light-based rain-fed light environment in Southeast Asia and moved back to Japan. And then people asked me to handle long-term experiments. And I know there are a lot of long-term experiments on light-based system in Japan, but I know at the same time I'm the only participant from Japanese universities. Yes, this is our field. Probably you may be surprised to see that, I'm sorry. We have lots of big pressures of houses and apartments around our fields. And then, say for example, if when I am to apply manure, and then I always have to consider the direction of wind. So to make sure that, you understand what I mean. Okay. Well, there are several long-term experiments happening at our universities. First is the maturation process of crop fields in 2-year rotation of maize, barley, soybean, barley. And then the second one is organic manure versus chemical fertilizer. And the third one is we are looking at the yield reduction after cessation of fertilizer, residual effects. And also fourth one, this is still at the hatchery stage, just a new baby, started last year. And the fifth one is to compare the deep tillage, normal, and minimum tillage. Okay. By the way, I'm not going to the details on each data set, but just to give you some brief idea to what's going on in our universities. Okay, it's been already published. Unfortunately, we tried to continue these experiments, but university management people decided to dispose the field, by sale, under the big pressure of housing the apartments around. Anyway, we could get the good information, but in these experiments, barley responded a lot to a nutrient input. By the way, this is the chemical fertilizer F and organic manure M. And then soybean, less response to the nutrient inputs. Yes, and also we set up another long-term experiment in other field in 1993. And again, we are receiving the big pressure from houses around here. But anyway, we are always seriously concerned about the manure application. And then look at the average crop performance. Maize cropping, almost the same level as, chemical compound fertilizer, I'm sorry. And then, but if we look at the winter wheat, almost the same, but it's very variable because of the temperature regimes in the winter season. In the warm winter, we can see lots of nitrogen mineralization, but in the cold winter, we cannot observe lots of mineralized N. That it would really affect the crop performance for winter wheat. Yes, this is a quick picture to compare the different treatments like that. And then here, no fertilizer input. It's like that. And then yesterday, when I checked the long-term experiments here at Rothamsted, and then also observed the serious problems of this wholesale perennial weed species, which is really affecting our experiment as well. We are now seriously discussing how to manage this trial, because year by year, this weed species is expanding. Okay, this is just to give you some yield data, organic manure, standard rate of fertilizer, and then average performance would be good, but in some years, in a cold winter season, in a cold year, performance is not so good, like that. And then we also carefully checked some grain quality and then grain growth in the at post-anthesis stage. I'm not going into the details, and published already. Yes, just to give you some ideas how grains look like. Organic manure, and then smaller grains, and then high kernels, gleanings. It's okay for wheat for bread, but our consumers in Japan, they are also using it for noodles, and it requires a low protein content, high grain yield, but it should be low protein content. So it's not easy to get the good grain quality from organic manure application. Yes, another one, this is my favorite experiments to look at the residual effects of soil nutrient on crop growth, started in 2009, 2007, wheat, maize, like that. And then when you see this one is a winter wheat, the nutrient uptake and biomass, and while blue one is maize. And after 5, 6 to 10 years, wheat, 20 to 25% reduction, but maize, 75 to 80% reduction, while maize, less. Okay, it's like that. So you could see that the nutrient use efficiency would be different between the two crop species. And also, we are also monitoring the yield performance of the different nutrient treatments. Like this is 50% rate since 1993, almost 50% reduction. This is consistent. While if we look at the no input since 2007, the last slide I explained about biomass, but if we look at the grain yield reduction is almost the same, because maize harvest index as well is also reduced by no application of fertilizer. This is very interesting. Next one is also we did look at some crop parameters like LAI, radiation use efficiency, and specific leaf nitrogen and the others, but I'm not going into the detail, but probably you could have some ideas what's going on between maize and wheat, right? Yes, my colleague is also checking the nitrogen dynamics in the root zone, and then this is the organic manure and the no fertilizer and the standard rate of fertilizer and the low rate of fertilizer. It's like that. Okay. This is the timing of crop harvest to taking out. And also this is the timing of fertilizer application. Also, our new colleague who is interested in pest ecology and soil microbiology, he asked me to join these long-term experiments to look at the pest ecology like that. And this is just a preliminary result. Oh, what's that? By comparing between the zero input and standard rate of fertilizer and organic manure, soil animals is very much different. And probably you could easily imagine the result, but other insects also different between the treatments. This experiment is still ongoing. And also last year we set up the new experiments on NPK omission trials, which is connected to student training. This is very important for us for the long-term survival of the long-term experiments. So this long-term experiment is connected to hands-on training of undergraduate students, not for publication, not for research purpose, but it should be connected to training of students. So we are applying the nutrient with students and measuring the plant nutrition parameters with students, and including the statistical analysis. Also, we accepted several students from Bonn universities last April. Yes. Yes, this is the appearance last May. And this is the NDVI value, 0.77 versus 0.38. It's like that. Okay. So this is my last slide. Already Kate from UC Davis summarized the prospects and challenges, so I'm not going to the details. LTE as a platform for field-oriented research education at our university, which is very important for survival, crop ecology, soil chemistry, nutrient cycling, pest ecologies, and then nowadays we are now planning to do some soil microbiology, although Bram emphasized what's the meaning of the result, but we still have some budget for DNA sequencing, so we will do that. Weed ecology and remote sensing captured by UAVs to separately distinguish the different weed species. This is also planned, and he's actually, yes. And there's 3 messages: simple and affordable long-term experiments to be able to hand over to next researchers. For example, when I am to move to other places or retire, someone has to take care. That's the biggest problem. Yeah, this is really true. And the second point is education versus publication. This is also my dilemma. Beyond maintenance work, it's possible. And then also conservativeness, but it should be flexible to accommodate all kinds of researchers who would be very much interested in the long-term experiments at the university. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah. Unfortunately, the time is up again. Yeah, thanks. The last flash talk is going to be given by Fernando Salvagiotti. I know it's one of the two. Yeah.
Yes.
10 minutes, please.
Okay. Well, this is the last presentation, I think. So, 10 minutes. 5 seconds less. Now, I want to show some results of long-term experiment in Argentina. We have several experiments in Argentina. I will show you just one that we began with the objective of the sustainable intensification. It's a baby long-term experiment. It began in 2006, but we have some interesting results. This is the Argentinian where we have more close to 20 million soybean acreage, and this is our big problem because most of this soybean is planted as monoculture. So we have very important issues regarding sustainability. So I will show you, this is the research station, this is the Pampean region, and this is our research station. What you have here in red is a Landsat image in 2006 showing that all the red is soybean, and mostly as monoculture. That's a very big problem we have to deal with. So agriculture in Argentina is mainly rain-fed. It's mainly planted on silty loam soils that are very susceptible to compaction, and this is a very big issue. And we have medium fertility, but with N, P, and S deficiencies are main problems. So this is important because these are the aspects that we have to take into account for evaluating what are our sustainable intensification in the long term. This is our problems, how we will deal with these problems. So reduction in soil organic matter, with degradation of soil physical conditions, with decreasing water availability that is related with the physical conditions, and low resource efficiency. So in our vision, we had to take in account all these things and to have early sustainable intensification indicators to evaluate and to say to the people how good are we are. So just to see our soil physical condition, we use the profile. This is the cultural profile method, and we can see here this is the compacted anthropogenic compacted areas in the first 20 centimeters of depth. This is a good soil, this is a bad soil, and this is a very, we observe these conditions under soil monoculture. So, as I told you before, we have this is our long-term experiment that we began in 2006. If we go there, with our spatial arrangement, we have sequences. Our main hypothesis is that if you use serials within it, in the sequence, we have a very more roots that explore, and it can break these compactions. So this is why we put different sequences, including different degree of serials. Also, we have mechanical decompaction in these experiments combined, all for statisticians we have 3 replicates. All these combinations we have in the experiments. That's what we can do for in front of these physical limitations. So I will show you that our temporary arrangement. We began in 2006 with a monoculture soybean, including a cover crop, a grass cover crop, with a recommended rotation with wheat and maize, and the same with cover crop. But in 2009, we include a more intensive rotation here without the full season soybean. So, and what I show you is what happens in the soil in this in 2015, where we have 3 cycles of this rotation and 3 cycles of the more intensive rotation. What we can see, all this rotation, we have a very ample degree of occupation. This is the soybean. This is occupation of how much time we have a crop with a green crop in the field. This is almost 40% of the time. And this is more intensive rotation. We have close to 80% of the time in the sequence. But we can see in the same rotation, we can see what is the proportion of cereals in the sequence. We have the 0 to almost 75% of cereals in the sequence. That is what we have a very good degree of variation in the cereal presence. So we will see what happens with some soils and crop variables after 9 years. This is our trend. This is soybean yield. I will use soybean as indicator. This is our target crop. And we can see here, now, in general, there is no difference. Always this is the maize soybean with soybeans rotations. We have a trend that is always up. And in the last years, we have seen an increase, not very much increase in yield, but still important. When we evaluate at the cropping system level, summing up 6 years of water consumption, we have that this is totally about transpiration. This is what is in the fallow, what is used in the fallow, what is used by crop. We want to use here to have a higher efficiency crop. Obviously, with soybean, we have the lower efficiency use of water in front of this other. But including a cover crop between 2 soybeans have the higher value. Remember, this is the initial condition of the experiments about these anthropogenic compaction areas. And after 6 years, this is the control, the soybean crop that have the same proportion of this massive delta, these compaction areas. But as we increase, this is a cover crop, including a cover crop, or made soybean with soybean, or more intensive, we decrease the amount of these compact sectors areas. When we evaluate infiltration, this is the soybean, this is the more intense, this is the proportion of cereal in the rotation. That is interesting to have this in our experiment. We can make a quantitative evaluation of the infiltration of cereals. We can see that infiltration, this is the speed of how water is going down the profile, is increasing. This is some kind of threshold that we have adjusted in our area. When we use resistance to penetration, this is the resistance is depth. This is the soybean monoculture, and as opposed to the more intensive rotation. And we can see here is natural, this increase in the resistance is natural, is not anthropogenic, but we can decrease this resistance with increasing the proportion of cereals in the rotation. This is carbon content at 3.5 centimeters. I didn't say you, but all these experiments are in the north tillage, so we want to have some results in the very upper layers. And the soybean, including a cover crop or including all cereals in the rotation, we have an increased respect to the monoculture. This is some biological assessment that we made in the experiment. This is phosphatase enzyme activity. Just to see if this is a monoculture, and as we along the blue and the red lines, we can see an increase in phosphatase activity, and it's a good indicator of our intensification. This is the DGI profile with DNA in soil. This is an undisturbed area close to the experiments. And this is the monoculture sopping with and without monocrop. And we are increasing here the proportional cereals. And we can see here is that there are more lines, there are more bands or more dark bands indicating that we have more biodiversity. We have this channel diversity index. As long as we increase cereals in the rotation, we have a larger number. That is, we are having more biodiversity. We don't know if good or bad. So, just to finish, long-term experiments are useful to evaluate changes in soil crop properties as affected by sustainable intensification management options, what we think sustainable intensification is in our area. These options must be defined in order to find solutions to problems that affect local agricultural systems. O sea, their solutions are good in this area, is not good in other areas. We believe that the most limiting resource is usually define which sequence we have to find for our area. This is an area that we have 1,000 millimeters of rainfall. Perhaps this solution is not the same for an area we have 500 millimeters annual solutions. And our observations show us that soil indicators were more sensitive than grain yield in soybean in showing difference among the alternatives. In this short term, that is 9 years.
Yeah, thanks, Fernando. This was the last flash talk, so thanks to all speakers for really having stuck to the 10 minutes. We didn't discuss a lot, but I assume there will be more time for discussion in the context of the posters that are accompanying those flash talks. So we have one last talk this morning, which will be given by Andrew from Rothamsted for 15 minutes. Yeah. Welcome.
Yeah. Do you want those? Somebody's lost some glasses. Okay, so I have I guess I should thank my fellow organisers of this conference for giving me the rather unenviable task of talking about statistics and standing between you and your lunch. But hopefully I shall leave you with some food for thought. Okay. It's difficult to give a talk about statistics and long-term experiments at Rothamsted without referring to Fisher. And as Achim told us yesterday morning, Ronald Fisher, R.I. Fisher, was appointed as the first statistician at Rothamsted about 99 years ago. He was appointed as a temporary post to see if a statistician could do anything useful with the long-term experiment data. We're still trying after 99 years. But if you look at some of his early papers, he clearly had a focus on looking at those long-term experiment data. 2 papers in the early 1920s looking at studies in crop variation for experiment data from Broadbork, and then looking at the influence of rainfall on yield. Again, we're still doing this, and my PhD student, John Addy, will talk about what he's been doing in this very same area this afternoon. But there are other experiments that Fisher looked at as well, so some experiments on crop variation in potatoes as part of, which are annual experiments rather than long-term experiments. The early interactions that Fisher had with the LTEs and other experiments shaped his ideas about the principles for designing experiments. But it's maybe a little bit informative about where his ideas came from to actually see what he was faced with when he arrived here. This is what Broadbork looked like in 1919. I think there's 20 strips, I can't count from here, but long strips that were split in half, providing what I describe as pseudo-replication, no real replication at all, and a very systematic design. Hoosfield spring barley, a similar kind of problem. We have a series of different treatments along the sort of representing the columns, and also some nitrogen treatments representing the rows of the design. What some of us might recognize as the beginning of the ideas of what Fisher called factorial design. And, park grass, well, they just introduced the liming about, I think, 16 years before, 1903, I think, was when the liming started. again, a systematic allocation of liming to one half and unliming to the other half. There is actually some replication in park grass, but it's quite difficult to find it. I'll leave that for as a challenge for you to look at later. So, what were Fisher's ideas? In those first 10 years or so after he moved to Rothamsted, he developed the analysis of variance method, originally in a paper to another famous statistician known as Student, or William Gossett, and also in his two books published in 1925 and 1935. His initial work, his initial focus, was on providing reliable estimates of errors in field trials. And interestingly, in this paper in 1926, The Arrangement of Field Experiments, he talks about how the ideal would have been that you could collect data over a long period, 500 years would do, looking at the variation between pairs of plots that were treated the same, so that then when you treated them differently, you could see the effect and how it related to that variation that you saw without the treatments. Of course, nobody's ever going to do a 500-year-long trial, and so I guess Fisher had to come up with an alternative. And that's really where the ideas of replication and these various other design concepts came in. Really built around building a coherent theory, analysis of variance as we now know it, for analysing trial results, but incorporating these important ideas of replication, providing precision of information about different treatments, originally developed by Gossett in 1908 as the t-test, but formalised to allow us to look at more treatments. Randomisation. A lot of early trials were systematically arranged, and randomisation was a key part of the idea that underlay the ANOVA development that allowed us to make assumptions to allow us to draw conclusions from our data. Blocking, really what Fisher would talk about as local control, dividing the trial site into different areas that were expected to behave similarly, allowing us to remove those systematic differences from the analysis to see the really interesting things that we wanted to find. And the ideas of factorial treatment structure, recognizing that not all treatment comparisons are of equal interest, that there are actually some structure to the questions we're trying to answer, and that we could answer multiple questions within the same trial, with increased power by the way we built it and used this kind of structure. So, in thinking about this talk, I tried to think about what had changed since Fisher's time, reflecting back on what has happened to Broadbork, Hoosfield barley, and park grass. We've got some pseudo-replication introduced. The major challenge, though, is not replication. The major challenge, as far as Fisher's concerned, was randomization, the lack of randomization, that we couldn't separate out the spatial, the systematic effects within a field from the effects of the treatments that we were applying. As my time is running away, I'm not going to dwell on these ideas further, or even on the fact that I've surveyed the 25 trials that members of the GL10 network have contributed to look at the variation in those. My question is, are some of our trials too simplistic? Are we actually asking sufficient questions with them? And as a counter to that, are some of our trials too large? Are we actually wasting resources? A trial was described yesterday that I think had 225 treatment combinations replicated 3 times. To me, that's an incredible waste. We could answer more questions with probably 1/10 of the resource if we think about how we design those experiments better. So I've now left myself 7.5 minutes to introduce you to 5 statistical ideas about designing experiments. As a general idea, what do we need for new LTEs? We need our experiments to be representative and relevant. We need these new experiments, if we're going to produce them, to be flexible, to be adaptable, to allow us to modify the treatment structure, modify the questions we want to ask. But they should also be clearly influenced by the purpose of our experiments. What are we trying to achieve from these experiments? Possibly, we're interested in comparisons of specific treatments, but I suspect more likely now, we're wanting to understand the underlying system. We're wanting to provide data that we can use to model the processes behind what we're exploring. And that probably needs a different approach to designing experiments from the one that we're currently using. We should still be applying Fisher's basic statistical design principles, and I don't really have time to go into the idea that is commonly used, certainly within most of the statisticians who have been through Rothamsted, of the separate consideration of resources and treatments. Think about your questions and your treatments, thinking about the resources that you want to use, and then find the best way of designing the experiment to use those resources to answer those questions. Okay, 6 minutes to lunch. 5 ideas. First one, incomplete block designs. Blocks don't have to include a complete replicate of our treatment set. But often that will constrain, probably has constrained, the way we've thought about designing experiments. Here's a very simple design. It's called a balanced incomplete block design. It's got 5 treatments, but the blocks are of size 4. But I get the good information about all of those treatment comparisons by looking at those. And we can construct designs of this type for different combinations of numbers of treatments, block sizes, replicates, and so on. We can even extend the idea potentially to what's called an augmented incomplete block design, where we have a common control, treatment Z in this case, that appears in each of our blocks and provides us with an improved information comparing back to that control treatment. Another idea, confounded or fractional factorial idea, factorial treatment structure. This copes with really the fact that we may be wanting to look at the combined impacts of lots of different factors, but our resources are limited, usually financially. As the number of factors, factor levels increase, the total number of treatments increase, but we don't have the resources to look at them. Factorial structure, as Fisher pointed out nearly 100 years ago, provides us with this idea of hidden replication. That is, that we can use the fact that our treatments are replicated across other treatments to give us ideas about the variability behind the responses we're seeing. And that's what's really captured in these 2 ideas of confounded factorials. At the top here is a very simple confounded factorial where I've confused the 3-factor interaction between factors A, B, and C with the differences between the blocks. And here are the idea of a fractional factorial where I have used the 4-factor interaction as what's called the defining contrast to come up with a smaller set of treatments that still allows me to get good information out about the main effects and the low-order interactions amongst my treatments. And rather scarily, this provides us with the opportunity that we might have unreplicated, oh no, scare, or even partially replicated designs. We don't need to have full replication, but we could still answer some really interesting questions. Another idea that is common used in quite a lot of experiments is the idea of split unit or split plot designs. Statisticians generally tell you not to use these. Clearly that hasn't happened. An awful lot of the designs that we've seen so far have used split unit designs, often for really good reasons. They should be driven by our practical constraints. They're in fact an application of the idea of confounding that I just talked about. Here's a confounded design, a split unit design where I've confounded the main effect of factor A between the 2 blocks. Just the same idea as I had on the previous slide. Conventional approach to split unit design is rather constraining. And I guess the power that we now have in terms of statistical analysis has actually allowed a more imaginative approach to thinking about this. This was a design we started thinking about for the new long-term experiment that we've just implemented at Rothamsted, where we had 3 different crop rotation lengths, 7 years, 3 years, and 5 years, and we thought of grouping those sets of plots together as a split unit design. In fact, we didn't do that because there were some practical constraints that meant that that wasn't going to work. But it was an idea that split units don't have to have the same number of units. They don't have to have the same treatments within the split units. But we're grouping together sets of plots that are going to have the same, that have something in common in some way in their design. Fourth idea, I think, I'm losing track. A lot of the long-term trials provide replication. They provide replication in time. And they provide an opportunity to look at the effects of climate, the effects of weather on treatment effects. Fisher did this in 1926. Rotation experiments also, clearly, rotation treatments are also an important idea in terms of replication in space or time. The question is, do we need both replication in space and in time? So my design over here is for 5 different plots of the same rotation, but at different phases. And we can analyze those data either by looking at the variation within a year across all of our plots, or aggregating across time to look at to provide some replication within that set of treatments. They're phased, they're out of phase, but they still provide us with interesting information. Finally, 24 seconds to go. What's the purpose of our experimentation? As I said, are we interested in comparing treatments, or are we interested in modeling the system? Conventional blocked factorial designs are really good for comparing treatments. They're really bad, probably, for looking at for understanding the model system, understanding the system behind the responses that we're interested in. So, factorial treatment structure gives us one thing. One extension of that is the idea of response surface designs, but we need to think about what the variables are within that response surface. And sometimes there'll be emergent properties rather than things that we can control. And so maybe we're thinking about our input factors simply as a means to generate contrasting systems. But we need to know which systems we want to generate. And maybe that gives us an idea that we can use models to help us design our future experiments. What are the treatments that need to be looked at within an experiment? So some final thoughts. It says 0. The ideas of Fisher are still relevant now. But in the 99 years, the tools that we now have available for analyzing the data that we get from experiments allow us to be really imaginative about the way we design those experiments. I think the focus of our new LTEs, any new LTEs we design, should be on exploring the whole system. It probably requires what I describe as a model-based analysis rather than a conventional statistical analysis. I think we can use maybe simulation models to design more effective experiments, and that interaction between model and experiment is really important. We need to think about adaptive treatments. I haven't had time to pursue this idea any further, but it's something I started talking about with Andy Whitmore after his talk yesterday. And this whole idea that Andy also talked about that we're thinking about multiple objectives. So multiple objectives potentially mean different optimizations, if you like, that we need to think about together. Finally, I think the challenge I throw out to you is, what are the questions that we need to use LTEs now to answer? And maybe that requires a different way of thinking about statistical design. And I'm really happy to talk to people about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks. Yeah. So the time is up for this session. I believe we have seen a really diverse set of talks. A lot of food for thought, I would say, and I hope some of the points raised will be taken further in the workshops this afternoon and tomorrow, so we come up with some tangible outputs out of this discussion. So thanks everyone also for attending and participating, and I'm handing over back to Keith for some announcements, I guess.
Just quickly, check on the board on the back or ask somebody where your workshop room is. It's either in here or around the back or downstairs. There's still space on one of the sample archive tours if you wanted to go and see the archive, so sign up for that. And the museum is open. Well worth going to have a look at the museum. We're happy to show you where that is. If you don't want to go on tonight's long-term experiments tour, please cross your name off. You can wait down here until the party tonight, then you'll have to go up to the manor for the party. And one final thing, we would like to put all the presentations online so that after the conference, we and anybody who's interested can look at them. But obviously we need your permission for that. So we will be emailing all of you
who made a presentation to ask you if you will be happy for your presentation to go online. Please tell us if you're not happy, because if we don't hear from you, your presentation will go up on the website and then everybody will be able to access it. It will be online for everybody. Okay, so you must let us know. Yeah, open access. Thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch.
No matter what they say, you see, the game for me is you. The game for me is you.